Hi, and thank you for joining today's webinar. This is part of a 4-webinar series on assessment in a competency-based educational system. My name is Sean Duncan. I'm the Strategic Change Officer for the Center for Competency-Based Education by Empower Learning, or CCBE for short, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. So at CCBE, we provide comprehensive support to schools and districts in making their shift from a traditional approach to K-12 education to a standards-based and competency-based approach. So this includes foundational competency-based pedagogical support. So for example, around assessment, proficiency scales, instruction, as well as teacher observation and feedback and development. Also includes resources and, where appropriate, technology solutions. So in my role, I work closely with schools and districts to understand their needs so that we can work together to create support plans that include pedagogical training and resources, as well as perhaps technology solutions to help them make that transition to a more learner-centered model. So before I introduce today's presenters, let's cover a few logistical housekeeping items for today. So first of all, please follow us on social media. It's a great way to learn about upcoming events such as these webinars. So you can follow us on Twitter at Center for CBE, Facebook, Center for Competency-Based Education. Our website is centerforcbe.com. And then a little bit about the structure for today's session. So we have pre-recorded a session for you today. And however, while we are playing that, we are actually actively monitoring the Q&A in the background live. And when I say we, I'm referring to Dr. Marzano, Matt Shea, and myself. And at the conclusion of the playback of that recording, we will address all of those questions you submit live. So we'll come back on camera and be there to address those and just enhance the conversation. So speaking of enhancing the conversation, please don't hesitate to use the chat feature as well. And we'll just engage there in addition. So as I mentioned, today is part of a series of webinars on assessment in a competency-based system. Today's focus is on obtrusive assessment. The remaining 3 webinars will focus on those next 3 topics there: unobtrusive assessment, student-centered assessment, and then finally calculating current summative scores. So as I mentioned, I'm joined today by Dr. Robert Marzano and Matt Shea. So quick introductions here. Dr. Marzano is the co-founder and chief academic officer of Marzano Resources. He's the founder of the Marzano Academies. We are lucky to have him as our chief academic officer here at the Center for Competency-Based Education. And overall, during his 53 years in education, Dr. Marzano has worked with educators as a speaker, a trainer, and a consultant. So as many of you know and probably have read his books, he's authored many books and articles on topics that include things like assessment, instruction, writing and implementing proficiency scales, and competency-based education, just to name a few. So welcome, Dr. Marzano. Matt Shea is the Executive Director of Client Services at the Center for Competency-Based Education. He is a former teacher, curriculum director, and district administrator in a competency-based district in Maine. So with that background, he's quite skilled in leading the shift from a traditional system to a competency-based system as both a teacher and an administrator. And he works to support many CCBE clients in those capacities. So welcome, Matt. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Marzano and Matt Shea.
Okay, today we're talking about obtrusive assessments. And so let's explain what those even are here. So first of all, our outcomes for the day, we're going to do just that. We're going to figure out we're going to understand the nature of obtrusive assessments and we're going to understand some strategies of using these obtrusive assessments today. So first of all, what are they? Obtrusive assessments is when instruction stops to allow for an overt assessments. So you're not doing any teaching at that point. Everything stops and you give an assessment to kids. It is obtrusive. It is kind of in the way for what we're doing here. Okay, obtrusive assessments, they focus on a specific measurement topic and they're derived from the corresponding scale. So as we've talked about before in our series on proficiency scales, everything revolves around the scale and how we can report to kids what they know and what is next for them. So some things to keep in mind about these the nature of obtrusive assessments. It's critical to consider all of the topics separately and assign them separate scores so the scores are as meaningful as possible. So we don't want to give one score for any of these assessments if we're assessing, let's say, 3 different skills or 3 different measurement topics. We don't want to combine those into one score. Go ahead, Bob.
I'm going to add a little technical note to that. Yeah, another way of saying this is that ideally every obtrusive assessment, every assessment is unidimensional, and that's a kind of a measurement term. It's got one dimension that you're measuring, and so in general, if you create an obtrusive assessment, if it focuses on one measurement topic, one dimension, then you give 1 score. But if you do create an assessment that has multiple topics, multiple dimensions, then you score each one of those separately. And that's really a big one. It really is, because if you have multiple dimensions and you give 1 score, that score doesn't tell you anything. But by the way, watch this one in this presentation in conjunction with the other 2 that follow. There'll be one on unobtrusive assessments, and then there'll be another on student-centered assessments, and then finally we'll have another one on how you put that all together. On TV now, where they have, especially the news, they have warnings about some of the scenes you will see might be, might jar your reality. Yeah, same thing here. This, if you listen to all 3 of these, most probably it's going to change the way you look at assessment from now on. It really is a paradigm shift, and you're going to see a lot of things you're very, very familiar with. But so I didn't mean to scare you. I think it's an exciting change. I really do, and classroom teachers who do it, agree with that.
I would agree. Before we move on here, when I first moved to more of a proficiency-based model, you're right, in the assessments, they were all similar assessments that I was doing before, but the way I was approaching them completely changed. And the way I presented them to kids completely changed, because the assessments that I was giving now gave me a lot more information than I had before. And at first I was like, holy crap, I don't even know what to do with all of this stuff now, because now I have way more information than I thought. And once I explained that to kids also, they're like, well, we always kind of knew that, but you gave me like an 88. And I think that's good. So now you're giving me like a 3 and a 2 and a 2.5 on this test. Now I know where I am. And I had one kid say that to me, and it was like, yeah, you're right. This is a lot better. So it is mind blowing. I totally agree with you on this one. Let's get back to the webinar. All right, so let's talk about some individual types of obtrusive assessments. We're going to go over some selected response, some short answer assessments, some essay assessments, some demonstration assessments, and finally, we're going to talk about some interviews or probing discussions with kids. And we'll go into each one of these separate types of assessment. Okay, so what is going to happen as a use of some of these obtrusive assessments? We kind of just talked about it a little bit with my experience in the classroom, but what kids are going to do is they're going to use that feedback that we give them as teachers to reflect and judge the status of their own knowledge. So if we're giving a kid a 2.5 on a particular scale on a particular assessment, they know immediately what they need to be working on, because they can look right at the scale, say, okay, I've got all of this foundational level knowledge. I have some of this more complex knowledge here. Okay, and the direct feedback from the teacher on that assessment will tell us exactly what they need to do next. So it is a lot more specific for the kids. The other thing that really helps the kids is they can talk about their scores with the teacher and how they relate to those scales. Again, it's a lot more information for the teacher and the student. And no longer is it teacher judgment, you get a score, you give it to the kid, we move on to the next one, it all averages out in the end. It's all about the learning and where am I in my learning right now. All right, so let's talk about one of the first ones here. We talk about selected response items, which are just assessment items that ask learners to choose an answer from a set of options. We talk about a traditional multiple choice assessment. We have an example there, a music example, where they can pick A, B, C, or D. We have a matching assessment where they can match things in column A to the correct items in column B. Anything you want to add to those two, Bob?
No, what you'll see is the item types, are going to be, especially these. They've been around for forever, but you'll see really soon how you score these is very different.
Yes, agreed. Okay, let's try a couple more. We have alternative choice assessments. So you've got the stem of a question. They have to pick one of two similar options. You have a true false, pretty straightforward. And you have multiple response where you can potentially choose multiple of those multiple choice ones. So there's more than one correct answer. Okay, we go on to some short constructed response ones. And this one is a little bit different from what we just had because now students have to have a written response instead of just picking from a list. Okay, so it's a little bit more difficult for kids. These can also be demonstrations of skills. As we talked about some of the physical education ones or music before, but we can also talk about this one with math one, where they have to use a compass and a ruler to draw a 90-degree arc. They have to show their work. They have to use certain tools to draw a picture. So those can also be short constructed response items, even if you may not think that is really a constructed response item. So this one would really helped me a little bit think of what that was. This one is a little key right here, and I want to talk a little bit more about this one. These short items are usually assessed for score 2.0 content, the foundational level content. Now we see on screen here that they can be used for score 3 and 4, but this is not preferred. Can you tell us why a little bit, Bob, on this one?
Well, yeah, if you think about, and Matt's already addressed this, when you're looking at selected response, cognitively what's happening is I'm taking the item and I say, okay, here's what they're asking me to answer, but now they give me the answers, or they give me a list, and I go through those, and okay, that's the one that makes sense. I don't have to retrieve it. I don't have to do any kind of mental computation. I just really look at what I already know and say, that matches up with what I already know. What constructed response is different. I'm just given the probe, and I got to put that together in my own head. Now, with short constructed response, by definition, what I'm pulling up is usually information that very concrete, it's there. It's I don't really have to construct much. I just have to bring it up from my long-term memory. When you get to the level 4.0 content in a proficiency scale, almost by definition, the expectation is that students are putting together content in complex ways and maybe even very new ways for them. So they just don't work very well at that level. You'll use constructed response, that'll be a bigger as a type of constructed response.
Okay. So we talked about, we mentioned a little bit about how these are scored a little bit ago. So when we use a type of traditional type test like this one, we call this the format specific score, because it's a type of score that's dictated by the type of assessment given. So let's do a couple of examples of this. That format specific score, before we get into that, I apologize for that one, must be translated into a scale score alongside other scores of assessments of different formats. We don't want to weight any of these. And this is one common response when we're shifting from a traditional model to a CBE model, is that I think some of these assessments mean more than others. And usually what that means is kids are taking more time on it. It's a longer project. It's something that they had a week to write. Different things like that. It basically, it's a time factor for kids, so it should be weighted more. And the response with this one is, it's all about the learning and what they're showing. And if they're showing on let's say a short constructed response item type of assessment versus a longer project, what they're showing you for evidence on a scale is really the same thing at whatever level it is, whether it's a 2, 3, or 4. So that's why we don't like weighting those. It becomes that whole body of evidence. Okay, so let's talk about one of those ways to score them. And one of them is to examine their response patterns. Okay, instead of the points, we look for patterns for what kids know. That we have 3 different ways that we could examine those response patterns. Let's go through each one of them. One of them is percentage scores, one is response codes, and one is a flow chart. This one is the coolest one. I like this one. All right, so we're talking about percentage scores. As you can see, we've got an example here that is split up into 3 different levels: a score 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0. We have some item numbers. We have some points per item, which differ a little bit. And then the obtained points per item. So Bob, can you explain this a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, a couple things about this. When you're using proficiency scales, you're going to use a traditional test, you will break it up into items that are specific to the score 2.0 and maybe even put those all together, on the test. I like that idea a lot. And even tell students, hey, this first section here deals with the 2.0 content, and then certain items for the 3.0 and certain items for the 4.0. Notice that for the score 2.0, there are 5 items, and they've each been assigned 5 points by the teacher. That's fine, but we're going to translate all that. Score 2.0, there are 3 items, and they have worth 10 points. And for score 4.0, there are 2 items, and they're worth 10 points. Now, so far, it looks very traditional. Go over to the 4th column there, and now that's the score for a particular student. So let's say these are Matt scores. I'm the teacher. Matt got a 5 out of 5 in the first item, 4 out of 5 in the second item, et cetera, et cetera. 22 points for that whole section. Okay, and there was a possible 25 points. So Matt received 88%, on that. Now, that's important. We're scoring each level of the scale independently, and then we're going to put that all together. Score 3.0, Matt got 15 of the 30 possible points, and for score 4.0, Matt got 3 of the 20 possible points. So we got 88% on the 2.0, 50% on the 3.0, and 15% on the 4.0. Now we're getting away from a traditional way of scoring these. Traditionally, just be adding up the points across the different, levels of complexity. And then, total points earned divided by total number of points, and we translate that and do a grade. But that ignores the level of the content, whether it was 2.0, 3.0, or 4.0. So now with this, now the way we score it, the teacher says, okay, let me look at 2.0. Is there enough evidence for me to say that, hey, Matt is probably, a 2.0 on this? I can, fairly confidently say he got the 2.0 content. Now, reaction you might have is, now, wait a minute, he didn't get them all correct. Doesn't he have to have 25 out of 25? The answer is no. No, there's error in all assessments, ERROR. And error could be, Matt, forgot something, but he actually knew it. I, the teacher, when I was scoring, didn't actually give him credit for things. So we allow for a little bit of error. Question the teacher asks him or herself, am I reasonably confident that on the 2.0, Matt knows that content? And I could go back to Matt and say, hey, Matt, do this for me. Give me a little explanation of this, okay? That'll clear some up for me. But let's say I look at this, say, yeah, I'm all good. He's 2.0 for sure. Now let me look at the 3.0. Now Matt got 50% of that. And I say, is that enough to tell me that Matt deserves a 3.0? I know he deserves a 2.0 on this test. And the answer probably is no, that it's not enough. But boy, he knows something. Now let me look at the 4.0, 15% of that. Is that enough to say well, no, obviously not, but he got something. Now, the big question is, how do you put all those together? And the answer is, you say, is there enough to say 2.0? Yeah, 2.0. Is there enough to say 3.0? No, not quite, but that's where the half-point scores come in. I can confidently say, hey, Matt, Matt, you look good in the 2.0 content, the basic content, almost, you're getting there with the 3.0, you're a 2.5 on this. And I just kind of file it away that, hey, he gave the 4.0 a shot. Matt and I have a conversation about that. Now, what you see if you look at the whole series is that this will be one test in a series of one assessment in a series of assessments. And we're going to look at the pattern of math scores across all of those to come up with a final summative score.
So if I get a 2.5 on this one with this particular content, if I'm being scored on this in a traditional sense, where you just add up all the points and divide, as you mentioned, I get a 53 on this one. It's 40 points out of 75. And a 53 would go in my grade book, and Matt has definitely failed this test at this point, even though he clearly knows in this case the foundational level material. And Absolutely. That is not any of the feedback that would come back. It would just be the 53 and, do better next time.
Great point.
I also want to mention when you said about not getting like 100% of that 2.0 content in order to get the 2, that's where in the scales, as we mentioned in our last series of webinars about scales, that statement, no major errors or omissions.
That's right. No major errors or omissions.
Yeah. So if you're missing a few here, when we're writing some of these assessments, as you said, Bob, we always have some error in there, whether it's our error writing the assessment or the kid's error in providing that evidence on that one. So as long as there's no major errors, I think you're good to go. Whereas clearly in the 3.0 content, there's some major errors there. There's only half of the stuff that Matt knows at this particular point. So I think that statement is critical to remember. Even if it's not written explicitly in your scales, that's the generic version of your scale, that it should have no major errors or omissions, which will help guide you score. Okay, let's go to the next one. Some points to consider if you're doing these scores. We kind of touched on some of these before, but we definitely want to consider having a district-wide cut score for those levels, a district-wide cut score for those half points. Like in the last example, we had a 50%, and that was good enough. That level may change from teacher to teacher, and if we're finding that there's a wide variety, you might want to really nail that down and have an SOP for you as a district. And also, when we're doing a percentage score like this one way that we could do this one from the previous example, Matt has the 2.0 content. We've got this one. Doesn't quite have that 3.0 content. We're pretty confident that we don't have that one. So there's no possible way that Matt can get a 4 on this one because he hasn't got the 3.0 level content yet. Although, as you mentioned before, tried it, got a little bit, and file it away for future use at that point. So you can have those discussions with the student there. But the reason we don't want to move on there is because if the scale is written correctly, the higher levels can't be reached unless you have the lower levels. So it moves right on. So the 2 flows into the 3, flows into the 4. And so there's some technical examples. If you're finding your assessments are doing that, where kids can get a 4 without getting the 3, or can get the 3 without getting the 2, you might want to go back to look at your scale a little bit and see if it has that flow. Okay, another very similar example here is response codes. Instead of having it by points, we talk about codes here at this point. So Bob, do you want to go through this one?
Yeah, actually this came out, by the way, everything we're presenting to you has been around for about 3 decades, because we've been experimenting with this for a long, long time. It's really the same thing as the points, except they're just a faster way of doing it. If you kind of consider how teachers score an item that has multiple points, let's say a teacher has an item that has 10 points. Well, what they do is they really kind of make up a little rubric in their head as to what a student has to. It's easy to give a 10 or a 0, right? Well, how do you give an 8 versus a 4 versus a 2? You know, so they make up a little rubric in their head to say, okay, to get a 2, they have to have this, or they should. Otherwise, that their system changes from student to student. Yeah. So response goes when you say, well, let's do correct means they got C correct, they got it all. I means incorrect, they didn't get all of it. You know, instead of assigning points, and PC means they had partial credit. Now, actually, some teachers, particularly the secondary level, liked, instead of just PC, they like to have high partial and low partial. You know, so to even more, a little more discriminating. Now you basically have the same thing, but you're not dealing with points. So in this case, now you just look at 2.0. You know, gee, got them all correct. That's a simple, you know, correct. 3.0, gee, they got a couple partials there. I can't give, I couldn't give them a 3.0 on that one. And then with a 4.0, you know, that's incorrect. And you're kind of left with the same thing, except it takes about 1/3 less time to score the assessment when you do it this way, and you come out with the same thing. And we just, you know, I forgot how we came upon this. It probably was from a teacher who said, hey, there's a quicker way of doing this and coming up with the same thing. So response codes: C, totally correct; I, incorrect, or whatever. Part P, C, partially correct, or high partial; HP, and low partial. And you got exactly the same thing going.
Yeah, this is the way that the AP scores are scored, all the AP tests that kids take. I used to be an AP reader, and we scored at EPI for, I think, I forget, now that I say that, I forget exactly what E means, but I think it was excellent, partial, and incorrect. The E was probably wrong there, but the same pattern as this one. You look for patterns in the assessment, and then to be able to give it a number score, we had a list of all of the different patterns that kids had equals this score. So basically we're just looking for, are they correct on this one? Most likely, with no major errors or omissions. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but if it was correct, or if it was partially correct, or if it was incorrect, you look at the codes and you come out with a score. Exactly the same pattern as this one is how the AP scores are scored. So this one appeals to me quite a bit as a former AP reader. We just kind of went through that, exactly what they meant here. So the flowcharts one I mentioned was one of my favorite ones. It's also obviously one of the more complex ones, since we've got a lot of text on screen here, and we're going to show you the flowchart next. But the flowchart, you have to have, and this one may be the biggest issue, a valid, well-constructed proficiency scales with specific explanations of content at 2, 3, and 4. We mentioned a little bit a few minutes ago that those really had to flow into each other, that you can't get a 3 without getting the 2. You can't get a 4 without getting the 3. They have to be totally combined like that one. So that's your first condition. Your second one is you have to have items first score 2, 3, and 4. So the flowchart approach clearly wouldn't work at like the beginning of work for kids on a particular scale, because they're probably just working at that 2.0, that foundational content. So flowchart doesn't happen really until the scale is mostly learned. At that point, you want to show evidence. 3, as we just mentioned before, they all depend on each other. And number 4, the items have been developed. So 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0 is reliably measured according to the scale. Again, those are 4 really tough conditions. So the flowchart is probably going to be your least used version of how to examine these patterns. But let's take a look at the flowchart here. Oh, it's big. There's a lot going on here. But I love it because it starts right where we want to at the top here. Any major errors or omissions regarding level 3. We're always looking at the level 3 to begin with. Especially, again, this is an assessment that you would do at the end of a scale when kids have learned some of that 2, 3, and 4 stuff and are showing some evidence here, because you have to have questions on all 3 levels. Okay, so start at the 3. Are they proficient on this scale? Okay, do they have any errors? Yes, they do. Okay, so let's go to the left here, and we'll talk about any major errors regarding level 2. Okay, yes, they do have some of those. Okay, do they demonstrate partial credit for level 2? And further on down it goes. So it's easy to score. You have all the possible scores here from 0.0 for every half point up to score 4.0. And we just answer the questions as we're going through that flow chart for whatever assessment we have that has 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0 questions. There's a lot going on here. A lot going on.
Yeah, we actually came up with this again quite a long time ago, but the district, excuse me, was using it more as a, what can I say, a kind of a placement device. In other words, they had, let's take, for math 4th grade, math 5th grade, they had their topics, and they had created really solid scales and assessments for each one of those. And now a student comes in, they want a fairly quick view of what the student can do. Now they say, well, let's give Bobby, the assessments for the 10 topics at the 4th grade level. I do all of that, but in scoring it, they use this system. They start with the 3.0. And they say, did he know this? Yeah, let's go to the 4. So it's a very quick way of scoring to give you a feel for what students know and don't know. We recommend that individual teachers do this. But now imagine if you did this for the 15 topics, for the year, for your subject area. Once you have this becomes a really powerful device for getting a very efficient way of identifying what students know and students don't know across the various topics that you'll be covering.
Agreed. Okay, let's go to another couple ones here about common assessments. We have an example of a middle school geometry assessment here. Again, this is organized the same way Bob talked about earlier, where they're broken into 2.0 level, 3.0 level, and 4.0 level.
Just a qualifier on this. Yeah, we would recommend far more items than we put here. Okay, this was to get it all on one slide. But the idea,
agreed.
Yeah, the idea though is that, hey, you've got a 3.0 section, a 4.0 section, 3.0 section, 2.0 section.
Agreed. Okay. The next one is about essays, and essays, they provide students with more structure, more opportunity. So we have a really basic level one here. It's a middle school essay assignment about sleep. And again, it's broken up into 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0. And it gives some specific questions that kids need to answer. And we have a more complex level essay in this next one here, which usually has some longer responses. This one happens to be a high school one about claims and evidence to support. And again, broken up into 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0, and gives some more complex questions that kids will need to answer without kind of like the one we had before, where we had like 3 or 4 lines that kids could write on. Now we actually want kids to actually show their evidence with more of the complex analysis and longer responses on this one. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, again, teachers can do the same type of thing here. They can use percentages, they can use those response codes. What if we had multiple scales in one of those essays as before? Let's talk about this one right here, making claims and using evidence to support. What if we also had a couple of other different scales that we're scoring from these essays? We're not going to score it just once. You don't get a 1 score on that essay if you're scoring multiple scales. We circle back to this at the beginning here, where if you have multiple scales on any type of assessment, you want to give an individual score for each one of those scales, because what you're doing then is giving feedback specifically on a scale that you can then help your kids with what's next, what were they missing, what were they good at, so they know what's next for them, as opposed to clumping it all together and coming out with that 88, for instance. What does that mean? Did I do really well on something and not so well on another? And what were those things? And the solution, of course, is scoring individually on those scales. So if, let's say, I had 3 scales and I scored a 3.5, a 2, and a 3, I know immediately, well, the one that I got a 2 on, I need to do some more work on there because I only know the foundational level stuff here. I don't know any of that complex stuff, not even some of it, because I didn't get the 2.5. So I know where to hone in my learning and what's next for me as a student, as opposed to clumping that all together, which probably averages out to something like a 2.8 or something, which would round to proficiency. even though I'm not proficient on every single one of those scales. So very important to keep in mind, score against those scales individually. Okay, the last few, we talk about student demonstrations. This is where students create some type of understanding of their topic by doing something for the teachers. Again, the easiest ones are phys ed and music and art, language, that sort of thing. Some others are focused on mental processes or skills. So maybe they can use guiding questions from a teacher or a peer to really show what they know at this point. So we have an example of what to ask students during or after a demonstration. Things to ask are, what specific skills are you demonstrating? Did it go as planned? What'd you do well? What you struggle with? And what would you do differently? Some really good questions there for having the student reflect on what they know, how they presented it, what they could have done better on. So the feedback, in my case, when I'm doing this with a student, the feedback is all coming from the kid. I just happen to be asking the questions. But they are doing the demonstration, reflecting on what they do. So when they do it again, when they do another student demonstration, they're getting better at it every single time because they know what to work on. That's one of the ideas of like a capstone project in these schools. I know there are a lot of schools that aren't just doing a capstone at the end of like senior year in order to graduate, but they're working their way down in the grades. So kids are starting to do these little short versions in elementary school, and they do it every year as kind of a practice for that big senior level capstone, because it's not so intimidating if you've been doing this stuff a while. So for the kids, it just becomes part of what they do. They start just doing those demonstrations naturally because they have a scale to work on and they know what they need to demonstrate and what they need to work on next. So I think that's a really good model. That seems to be something that's taking over the country a little bit, is putting these student demonstrations even into the lower grades at this point, not just at the high grades. Okay, and the last one we talk about are interviewing or probing discussions. So Bob, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, this is actually my favorite type. And fundamentally with a probing discussion, the teacher sits down with a student. This is done one-on-one, and asks questions about content from the level 2, 3, and 4 content within the scale. Now, the nice part about this is you can, Matt's the teacher now, he can ask me a question level 2. He says, now go back and do that one again. How about this? What about, so he can ask questions based on my answers. That's why it's probing. He can get much more depth. And same thing, at the end, the teacher looks at Matt looks at my responses and, makes a judgment. Hey, did Bob demonstrate no major, the 2.0 content with no major errors or omissions? Yeah, that's solid. Yeah, for sure, a solid 2. How about level 3? Did he demonstrate no major errors? Yeah, he got to. How about the 4? Nah, not quite there. So now I give Bob a 3.5. What's really powerful about this is you get information from the interaction that you couldn't get from selected response items or even short constructed response. The research on this goes back about 25 years. There was Dr. Sheila Valencia, University of Washington. She did a study. It was on middle school math, I believe, looking at what she called probing interviews. We changed to probing discussion. And she looked at 4 different types of tests for each each topic. One was all selected response. The other one was all constructed response. The other was a combination of selected response and constructed response. And then the 4th one was the probing interview / probing discussion. Here's what she found, if my memory serves, and I think it does in this case, that you got 66% more information from the probing discussion than you could get from any of the others. And that's really powerful. If you're a secondary person, say, I can't have a probing discussion with every student. You don't have to. You really don't. It's one of the options in terms of assessment. We usually recommend, if you're not sure about a student's where they are, use the probing discussion with that student. So it's really kind of the thing you say, boy, they're all over the place with my tests. I don't have a good feel for where Bob is. Come on up here, Bob. Let's talk about this. And so it gets used as kind of the final solution in terms of, I really don't know. Let me sit down with him or her, and have this type of in-depth interaction.
Okay, and I think that wraps it up for today. Our next set of webinars, we alluded to earlier, we're going to talk about unobtrusive assessments. We're going to talk about student-centered assessments. You can always go back and watch our 3-part series on proficiency scales. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks, everyone, for watching through that portion of it. As I mentioned at the outset, we're live at this point, so we have received some questions to the Q&A. If you haven't been monitoring the chat, I've been prompting and prodding everyone to submit any questions you might have. So we are monitoring that and continue to live, so feel free to submit anything even right now. So let's jump into the first question. So our first one is, let me just go ahead and read this directly. The premise that a student should not be able to get a 4.0 if they can't succeed at 3.0 or 2.0 could be challenged. Research would suggest that the dyslexic brain may find 3.0 or 4.0 questions easier to answer than a 2.0 question. What are your thoughts?
Well, between Matt and I, we know everything there is to know about assessment. That Matt knows the answer to that one. I don't. No, I actually, I actually do.
Thanks, Bob.
Sorry. I actually do have a response to that. I'm sorry, but that didn't make any sense to me. That really doesn't. That this is research suggests, I'm not sure what research is being referred to there. In terms of a proficiency scale, I'm very sure about our recommendations for how to set those up. And by definition, the way they should be set up is that 2.0 content is necessary for the 3.0, and the 3.0 is necessary for the 4.0. Now, if the person asking the question is talking about questions, that's different. And I would agree, the question type so yes, selected response items in and of themselves have a cognitive load. They really do. And it might be that students, and then my guess is the person who asked the question was thinking in terms of the question, not the scale and not the content. And if that's the case, I agree. Just think about the nature of a selected response item. If you ask me in math to solve a problem, and if you just ask, it was in a sense, short constructed response, tell me your answer. What is it? I've got to solve it, and I put the answer down. But if you ask me to solve a problem and then give me 4 possible answers, now I have to evaluate each one of those. And that's a new cognitive task you've just given me. Same thing if the tests that we use now for reading comprehension, where what's the main idea? And you're given 4 possible main ideas. That is much harder than just simply reading it and coming up with your main idea, or your summary of the content. So depending on where the questioner was coming from, and I think it's the latter, that yes, you're right. Question types can be really difficult to maneuver. I actually did know that one. Yeah.
I knew you did. That's why I let you go first.
Okay, so here's another question. If my project I am assigning to kids takes a long time for kids, what are some ways I could alleviate the idea of no weighting of this project? So I think they heard the message during that about not weighting those. So they're just asking, how do we mitigate against that when we have in fact spent a lot of time?
Sure.
Okay, I'm not kidding this time. I really don't know the answer to that.
Oh,
but Matt does.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll take this one because this happened with my teachers quite a bit. Asked pretty much this exact same type of question. Is like, I'm doing this 6-week-long project, and I'm going to assess them at the end on their evidence. And everything that you say now is like, there's no weighting for this one. so what else do I do? And so we came up with the idea that we can really assess along the way in that project by giving kids a chance to reflect on some of the questions on where they are on that particular scale at that particular moment. So at the same time that we're getting kids to gain agency over their work, we're also gathering evidence over time, hopefully at the foundational level to begin with, more to the complex level near the end. So by the end of the project, you actually have a complete body of evidence at that particular point, and you haven't done any more assessing. Some could be more little formal assessments like we talked about today. Some could be some of those unobtrusive assessments, teaser for next time. But you're gathering evidence along the way. So when you have that final assessment at the end of the project, it's just one more piece of evidence that you have for kids along the way.
Good.
What Matt said, that's my answer.
There we go.
Okay, so this is a question that is very similar to the first one that I led off with. What happens in the various response patterns if a student gets the 3.0 content or the 4.0 content, but not the 2.0 content, at least not enough of the 2.0 for me to feel confident that they've mastered that 2.0 content?
Yeah, it is similar. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is it could be that your scale isn't well written, that the 2.0, and that's not uncommon because I've seen scales where the 2.0 content is very detailed information that is really, declarative information that's really not necessary, to demonstrate what's required at the 3.0 level. So it could be that, it really could. In that case, what you do is you rewrite your scale. That tells you your scale's off. Mm-hmm. Or it could be the student just kind of erring the student. And that's where item types could come in. They just don't respond well to that type of item. So what you do is you say, I'm the student, you say, hey, Bobby, let's go over this again. Explain that to me. You did a nice job in here and here, but let's go back to this area. National and state tests actually go through that process of adjusting their tests. And they spend tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars doing that. They create their tests and the items, they give it to a bunch of people, and then they look at those patterns of items in terms of the item difficulty. Actually, there's a whole area of measurement or item construction called item response theory, which is a very sophisticated way of analyzing items and the responses that you see. So putting together a test that really has a nice flow of the 2.0 to the 3.0 to the 4.0, it takes a lot. It takes thought, and that's not unusual. And the most common, though, I think, is that something's off with the scale, probably.
Yeah, I would say that as somebody who helped write scales for my own district, we found that was most of the case, that the 2 was off a bit, that you didn't need all of that stuff to get up to the 3 and the 4. So like always, you make adjustments to make it work based on the evidence that you're gathering from kids. So
that's actually in that flow chart why we start with a 3.0.
Yes.
Because if you start, you might say, well, why not the 2.0? If they've got that, it's because it's real easy to create a scale where the 2.0 is really not necessary. But if you go to the 3.0, you're cutting out a lot of that error that might be due to a scale that, doesn't have a nice flow in terms of difficulty levels.
Agreed.
Okay, here's another one. When would it be better to give an obtrusive assessment versus an unobtrusive assessment? It seems there is a big push in some districts to give more unobtrusive assessments than obtrusive.
Well, I'm sorry, I keep jumping in too fast. Unobtrusive is more, what's the term? Oh, heck, Matt, we used it last time. I'd use the alligator analogy. An alligator is they eat when the food walks by.
They're opportunistic.
Opportunistic, yeah. So that's how they're described. Really, alligators don't go out and do a lot of hunting. They just lay there and wait for lunch to walk by. Well, it's kind of the same thing with unobtrusive assessments. You don't plan for it, although you could. but if it shows up, score it right there. That said, in some cases, depending on what you're looking for, like if one of the proficiency scales you have deals with the writing process, which has observable things that students will be doing, you could set up a lesson so that students, if they're using the process as written, will demonstrate the different phases. And then it's unobtrusive because the students, nothing stops. They're doing what they're supposed to do, and you're going around and looking at what they're doing. But I actually kind of prefer for unobtrusive. If it's there, score it. If you see it, score it. Which brings up a point. Assessments, if you on a given day, you can have an assessment for one student only. And that's because that's the only student you saw do something that was solid enough. You could say, that's a 3. I'm gonna capture that. This notion, if we give an assessment, everybody has to be assessed. No, what you'll find is, in a system like this, the obtrusive, unobtrusive, and student-centered, you'll have very different numbers of assessment scores. We call them evidences within our LMS and Power, from student to student.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the question about the big push in some districts to do one over the other, I think might be a little misleading. The idea is to gather a body of evidence when you see that evidence for kids. And if we have all of these different opportunities for kids, like the alligator Bob was just talking about, if you're seeing the evidence, then score it. And if it's just that one kid, great. If it's a couple of kids, great. If it's no kids at that moment, that's okay too. We still want to be looking for that evidence against the scales whenever we see it and be able to track that as part of the body of evidence.
Perhaps a general rule to follow is that the more sure you are about a student's status on a proficiency scale, the less evidence you need. And the less sure you are, the more evidence you need.
Yep. Yeah, that's a
Good point. Okay, we have students who struggle with handwriting but can verbally answer the questions. We've seen this also as a gap in the 2.0 to 3.0 assessing. 3.0 and 4.0 are sometimes done digitally or as a presentation, and that makes it easier for them to access. So there's not really a question in there, but maybe
I think they've got their answer.
Comment on that.
Yeah, make adaptations for those students. Depends on what you're assessing, of course, but if you're assessing handwriting, it's a different thing, but they're probably not. Yeah, the item type should not get in the way, of collecting accurate information about students. So make whatever accommodations you need to get the information that allows you to say, they really have it, or no, they don't have it.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. It doesn't need to be something tangible that kids are passing in because they're writing it. If they're, like the question says, if they're verbally answering their questions, those probing discussions that Bob was talking about in the webinar, great. That's exactly what we want.
Yeah,
exactly what we want. Yeah, and you're right. If they're assessing handwriting, that's a different thing. But for the most part, gather that evidence however you see it, however you can get it from the kid. Totally agree. Good question.
Okay, we probably have time for a couple others before we close things out. So here's a question. Did the strategies you shared for obtrusive assessment fit into a larger body of work that is focused on competency-based instructional strategies?
Would you say that again, Sean? I didn't.
Yeah, do the strategies you shared, I think they mean in the recorded piece, for obtrusive assessment fit into a larger body of work that covers more competency-based instructional strategies?
I'm not sure what the question is.
So we had strategies built in around obtrusive assessment. So are there additional strategies for obtrusive assessment, strategies for other types of assessment that we'll end up covering in other webinars? And is that part of a bigger body of work versus we're doing these little standalone webinars? That's what they mean.
Well, but I mean, what we try to do is classify all the various ways you can assess students into 2 broad categories: obtrusive, unobtrusive, and student-centered. Mm-hmm. And if you put those all together, that represents the domain of assessment strategies that you can use, in a competency-based system. Now, what gets masked or falls through the cracks when we splice it up like this is, how do you put this all together to come up with a decision about a student as to, are they proficient or not? And that we cover explicitly in the fourth webinar for assessment, creating summative scores. And so I think if you watch, as Matt's already said this, if you look at our 3 webinars on proficiency scales, that should give you a good feel for our approach to that. If you look at the 4, on assessment, it's the last one, summative, identifying or computing summative scores, that really you should see where it all comes together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Bob, can you also speak to the fact that like assessment and proficiency scales fall, you mentioned domains just now, those are domains within a larger and entire instructional framework.
Oh yeah, no,
right?
sure. This whole
competency based.
Yeah, yes. No, this is so all these are building blocks to a well-structured and integrated competency-based system. Actually, if I'll be self-serving on this one, there's a company called Marzano Academies. It's a not-for-profit, and there's 4 books that have come out on that now, and that really contains the whole big picture, at least as I see it. And there are what we call 16 school level indicators that constitute, when done together, a robust competency-based system. Now, and Empower is embedded in every one of those. Now, a school that's not to say that a school or district can't create their own set of school level indicators, but within the academy model we do. So yeah, everything you do, if you're creating a competency-based system, this piece should fit with this piece, should fit with this piece, all leading to this one dynamic of identifying competency.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so final question here before we sign off. As a teacher, I sometimes become overwhelmed with the number of competencies, for example, in writing. How do we pick the focus and how do we get it all when students are demonstrating so many competencies in one piece?
Yeah, so I'll take that one because this has come up a lot with my ELA teachers. And they have the exact same type of question. They're demonstrating so much. So on any particular piece of writing, determine what you're going to be focusing on, that you are going to be actually assessing and giving scoring feedback on. It's possible for you to give feedback on everything, but for instance, on any particular piece of writing that kids are giving you, you can always assess grammar and punctuation. Okay, but it doesn't mean you need to score grammar and punctuation all the time. Just give some particular feedback on that if you want to. But if you're focusing about theme and author's purpose and author's perspective, for instance, I'm assuming those all go together somehow, then just give feedback and score on those things. You don't have to do everything all at once. They're going to demonstrate all kinds of stuff over and over and over again. Pick the ones you want to focus on, the ones that kids have already mastered or gathered a larger body of evidence on. Focus on another piece while they're doing the same type of writing all the time. So it's easy to get overwhelmed and think I need to have 12 scores on everything because I have 12 standards and they're demonstrating it all. You can't do it all. So just have a few focuses with like 2 or 3 at the most and don't score anything else. Give whatever else, like other feedback is fine, but only score 2 or 3 at the most at any one time. It's easy to get overwhelmed. It's a great question. Thank you.
Good. All right. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. But like we've mentioned numerous times, there are 3 additional webinars coming up. You obviously found out about this one either through our social media accounts or via email directly from me. So I'm going to actually.
Sean, you're muted.
Are you muted, John?
Yep.
Thank you.
That's okay. And I got to go, Sean. Thanks, everybody.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I just posted my email address. If anyone has additional questions, so we obviously ran out of time today, feel free to reach out to me. I'll get answers from Dr. Marzano and Matt in my responses. So just give me a little bit of time to get back to you. As we mentioned numerous times, this is part of a series of 4 webinars. So there are 3 more coming up. If you're not following us on social media, Facebook or Twitter, please do so because you'll learn about those there. Either that or via email. I just posted my email address. And this is obviously part of a body of work that we engage directly with clients on. So if there's anything that we could do to help support your system in these endeavors, we would be honored to do that. So with that said, thanks so much for joining us and take care, everyone. We look forward to seeing you on the upcoming webinars.
Thanks, folks.